The call that changed everything. Officer Daniel Reed leaned back in his creaky chair at the small precinct, the soft hum of the ceiling fan providing the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. The mid-afternoon lull was always the slowest part of his shift, and Daniel didn't mind. After over a decade on the force, he had learned to appreciate moments of calm. "Reed, you're on desk duty today," Sergeant Lewis joked as he passed by, slapping a file onto Daniel's desk. Daniel chuckled. "Someone's got to keep this place running while you chase car thieves." The banter was interrupted by the sharp crackle of the police radio on the desk. Dispatch's voice was strained with urgency. "All units near Broadmoor Street. We have a 911 call from a child." Line disconnected abruptly. Caller reported, "Please send help. He's coming back. Approximate location, 248 Broadmoor Lane." Nearest units respond immediately. Daniel straightened in his chair, his instincts kicking in. Broadmoor Lane was only a few blocks away. He grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 143. I'm in the vicinity. Responding now. ETA 2 minutes." He grabbed his keys, his mind already racing. A child's distress call was the kind of situation that made his blood run cold. He didn't wait for backup. Every second counted. As Daniel sped through the quiet suburban streets, he couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Broadmoor Lane wasn't a particularly high-crime area, but something about the faint plea in the child's voice gnawed at him. Who was coming back? And why did it sound like the boy was hiding something or someone? The modest homes on Broadmoor Lane came into view. Most were well kept, though a few showed signs of neglect. Pulling up to 248, Daniel's gut clenched. The house stood out starkly, shutters hanging crookedly, an overgrown yard littered with trash, and a sagging porch that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. A broken tricycle lay on its side near the curb, its wheels still faintly spinning as if it had been recently moved. He turned off the sirens but left the engine running. Grabbing his flashlight and radio, he stepped out and approached the front door cautiously. "Police," he called, his voice steady. "If anyone's inside, make yourself known. We received a 911 call from this address." No response. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint chirp of cicadas in the weeds. Daniel knocked firmly. Still no answer. "Dispatch," he said into his radio. "I'm at the location." No response at the door. "The house appears abandoned. Requesting backup for a welfare check. I'll proceed with caution." "Copy that. Unit 143. Backup en route." Daniel circled the house, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with unease. The backyard was in worse condition than the front. A swing set stood rusting in one corner, its chains creaking softly in the wind. He paused near a shattered basement window. It was boarded up, but one plank had been recently pried loose, leaving enough space for someone, or something, to crawl through. His flashlight swept the area, landing on a pair of small footprints in the dirt leading to the back door. Fresh footprints. His chest tightened. "Dispatch, I'm entering the property. Possible signs of a child present." The back door wasn't locked, and Daniel pushed it open carefully, the hinges groaning in protest. The smell hit him first, a rancid mix of mildew, stale air, and decay. The kind of smell that came from a house long neglected and full of secrets. Inside, the kitchen was a disaster. Dishes piled high in the sink, flies buzzing over crusted food remnants. The refrigerator hummed weakly, its door partially open to reveal spoiled milk and wilted vegetables. "Hello," Daniel called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "This is the police. If you're here, call out." From somewhere deeper in the house, a faint creak sounded. Daniel's hand instinctively rested on his holstered weapon as he followed the noise. His flashlight revealed a narrow hallway, the wallpaper peeling to expose water-stained walls. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and the stench grew stronger. He pushed the door open, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. A child's voice rang out, trembling and faint. "Please, don't hurt me." Daniel froze. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his tone gentle. "I'm with the police. I'm here to help. Are you hurt? Can you tell me where you are?" There was a moment of silence. Then the voice spoke again, barely above a whisper. "I'm in here." Daniel followed the sound, his flashlight illuminating a closet door at the far end of the room. He opened it cautiously, expecting to find the boy hiding. What he saw instead made his breath catch. Inside, huddled against the wall, was a frail boy with wide, terrified eyes. His face was gaunt, his clothes tattered, and his arms wrapped protectively around himself. But it wasn't just the boy's condition that shocked Daniel. It was the fact that this boy, pale, trembling, and frightened, was his son, a shattered past. For a moment, Officer Daniel Reed couldn't breathe. The small boy sitting before him, chained to the wall of the closet, was someone he had thought about every single day for the past 2 years. His son, Caleb. "Caleb," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking as he knelt in front of the trembling child. "It's me. It's Dad." Caleb's sunken eyes squinted at him as if struggling to believe what he was seeing. His lips quivered, and he let out a tiny, broken whisper, "Dad." Daniel's heart shattered. He reached out carefully, not wanting to startle Caleb. "Yes, buddy. It's me. I'm here now. You're safe." His voice wavered, a mix of relief and anguish surging through him. The boy shrank back at first, his thin frame pressing into the wall as if expecting pain. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Caleb leaned forward, weakly reaching for his father. Daniel pulled him close, cradling him as though afraid he might disappear. "I'm sorry," Caleb mumbled, his voice muffled against Daniel's chest. "I didn't know what else to do. I called because he was coming back." "Sha, it's okay now," Daniel said, brushing a hand gently over Caleb's matted hair. "You were so brave, Caleb. You did the right thing. I'm here now, and no one's going to hurt you again." As he held his son, the weight of the past 2 years came crashing down on him. The bitter divorce, the endless court battles, the way Caleb's mother, Sarah, had spiraled out of control after their separation. Daniel had fought for custody, but Sarah's accusations about his dangerous job and long hours had swayed the court. She had won full custody, leaving Daniel with limited visitation rights. Then, without warning, she had disappeared, taking Caleb with her. He had searched, filed reports, even hired a private investigator. But every lead had gone cold. The thought of his son, his bright, laughing Caleb, lost in a world he couldn't protect him from, had haunted him every day since. And now, here he was, broken and battered, in a filthy house that reeked of neglect. "Caleb," Daniel said gently, pulling back slightly to look into his son's face. "Where's your mom? Do you know where she is?" Caleb hesitated, his thin fingers clutching Daniel's uniform. She's gone. She left a while ago with Lucas. He's the one who keeps me here." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Lucas," he repeated. "Who's Lucas?" "The man Mom brought home," Caleb said, his voice barely audible. "He's mean, Dad. He yells a lot. Sometimes he hits me. And he locked me in here when I made too much noise." Daniel's grip tightened protectively around Caleb. Rage boiled beneath his calm exterior, but he forced himself to stay composed. Caleb needed reassurance, not an outburst. "It's okay, buddy. Lucas isn't going to hurt you anymore," he promised. "I'm taking you out of here. Right now." Caleb nodded weakly, his small body trembling. "I tried to call before," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't reach the phone. It was on the table, and I was too tired." Daniel glanced around and spotted an old, battered flip phone lying on the floor near the door. He could imagine Caleb, desperate and starving, mustering all his strength to stretch for it. His heart ached at the thought. "You did so good, Caleb," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so strong, buddy. I'm so proud of you." He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 143. I have a child on site, approximately 8 years old, in critical condition. Request immediate medical assistance and backup. Suspect may be returning to the location. Over." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Unit 143. EMS and additional units en route. ETA 4 minutes." Daniel stood, cradling Caleb in his arms. The boy felt impossibly light, as though he hadn't eaten in days. As he carried him out of the room, Caleb's head rested against his shoulder. "Dad," Caleb murmured, his voice trembling. "What if he comes back?" "He won't," Daniel assured him. "I won't let him hurt you. Not ever again." They made their way through the decrepit house, Daniel's sharp eyes scanning every shadow for signs of danger. He reached the front door just as the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, their wailing a promise of rescue. As the ambulance pulled up, 2 paramedics jumped out, their faces hardening as they saw Caleb's condition. "What's his status?" One of them asked. "Severely malnourished and dehydrated," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "He's been locked in a closet for God knows how long. I need you to take care of him." "We've got him," the paramedic assured him. They moved quickly, taking Caleb from Daniel's arms and laying him gently on a stretcher. The boy's eyes fluttered open, panic flashing across his face. "Dad!" he cried, reaching for Daniel. "I'm right here," Daniel said, gripping his hand tightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. I promise." The paramedics began their work, starting an IV and checking Caleb's vitals. One of them frowned. "BP is low. Pulse is weak, but stable. We need to get him to the hospital ASAP." Daniel nodded, stepping aside so they could load Caleb into the ambulance. He was about to climb in after him when a police cruiser screeched to a stop nearby. Officer Angela Torres, one of his closest colleagues, stepped out. "Daniel," she said urgently, "what's going on?" "It's Caleb," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I found him here. He's been through hell." Angela's expression softened. "We'll handle the scene. Go with him. Your son needs you." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before climbing into the ambulance. As the doors closed behind him, he took Caleb's hand once more. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered. "We're going to the hospital now. They'll help you get better." Caleb nodded weakly, his small fingers curling around Daniel's. "You'll stay too?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Always," Daniel said firmly. "I'm not leaving you. Not ever again." As the ambulance sped through the streets, Daniel held Caleb's hand tightly, silently vowing to never let him go again. But beneath his determination, questions burned in his mind. Where was Sarah? Who was Lucas? And how had it come to this? For now, though, all that mattered was Caleb. And Daniel would do everything in his power to make sure his son never had to face such horrors again. Shadows of the past. The hospital waiting room buzzed with the low hum of activity. Nurses wheeling carts, the soft murmur of families speaking in hushed tones, and the occasional chime of a monitor from a nearby room. Officer Daniel Reed sat hunched over in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the floor. Every fiber of his being was focused on the closed door across the hall, behind which the pediatric trauma team was working on his son, Caleb. Minutes felt like hours, each second dragging on as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The sight of Caleb's frail body, the marks on his wrists, and the hollowness in his eyes replayed in Daniel's mind like a torturous loop. He rubbed his face with his hands, trying to clear his thoughts, but the guilt refused to leave. "Reed," a familiar voice said softly. He looked up to see Officer Angela Torres approaching, her dark eyes filled with concern. She held 2 cups of coffee, offering one to him. Figured you could use this. Thanks, Daniel muttered, taking the cup but barely looking at it. Angela pulled a chair over and sat beside him. The team on site found plenty of evidence at the house. Drugs, weapons, even some old CPS notices stuffed in a drawer. We've got forensics processing everything now. Daniel nodded numbly. Did they find Lucas or Sarah? Angela sighed. Not yet. Neighbors said they saw them leave earlier in the day. We've got a BOLO out for both of them. They won't get far. They've already gotten too far, Daniel said bitterly. 2 years, Tories. 2 years they kept Caleb hidden from me. And now, he trailed off, his voice breaking. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. This isn't on you. You couldn't have known what was happening. But you found him now, and you're here. That's what matters. Daniel let out a shaky breath. I should have fought harder. For custody, for visitation. Something. I knew Sarah was struggling after the divorce, but I let the courts convince me it was better to stay away. I thought I was protecting him. Angela stayed quiet for a moment before speaking. You've got him now. Reed. He's alive because you didn't give up. Don't lose sight of that. Before Daniel could respond, the door to Caleb's room opened, and a doctor stepped out. Her expression was serious but calm, her hands tucked into the pockets of her white coat. Officer Reed, she asked, looking at him. Daniel shot to his feet. That's me. How's Caleb? Is he okay? The doctor offered a small smile. He's stable, but his condition is critical. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished, which has put significant strain on his organs. He also has several untreated fractures, some of them older injuries that healed improperly. The marks on his wrists and ankles suggest prolonged restraint. Daniel felt his fists clench at his sides, anger simmering beneath his worry. But he's going to recover, right? With proper care and rehabilitation, yes, the doctor said. He's resilient, but it will take time, physically and emotionally. Right now, he's resting, but you can see him if you'd like. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, doctor. She gave him a sympathetic look before walking away, leaving Daniel to gather himself. Angela gave him an encouraging nudge. Go on. He needs you. Daniel stepped into Caleb's room, his heart tightening at the sight. His son lay on the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IVs. His small chest rose and fell steadily, but the bruises on his arms and the gauntness of his face were glaring reminders of what he'd endured. Caleb's eyes fluttered open as Daniel approached. Dad, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I'm here, buddy, Daniel said, pulling a chair close to the bed. How are you feeling? Caleb blinked slowly, his lips cracking into the faintest smile. Tired, but it's better here. It's not so scary. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping Caleb's hand gently. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again. Caleb's smile faded, his small fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Will Mom come back? The question hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Caleb, I don't know where your mom is right now, but I promise, the people who hurt you won't be able to do it again. She let Lucas hurt me, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't stop him. She just left. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm so sorry, Caleb. I should have been there for you. I should have kept you safe. Caleb's hand squeezed his. It's not your fault, Dad. I was just waiting. I knew you'd come. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, focusing on the boy in front of him. I'm here now, he said firmly, and I'm not going anywhere. Just then, there was a knock on the door, and Angela stepped in. Sorry to interrupt, but we got an update. We found Lucas. Daniel's head snapped up. Where? Angela's expression darkened. At a motel a few miles out of town. He was alone, but he didn't resist when we brought him in. He's in custody now, and he's already running his mouth. Daniel stood, his hands balling into fists. I need to talk to him. Angela held up a hand. Reed, I know how you're feeling, but you need to be careful. You're too close to this. I don't care, Daniel said, his voice low and cold. He hurt my son. I need to hear it from him. I need to understand why. Angela hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but you keep it professional. No losing your temper. Daniel glanced back at Caleb. Buddy, I'll be back soon. I promise. Caleb nodded, his tired eyes filled with trust. Okay, Dad. At the station, Daniel sat across from Lucas in the interrogation room. The man was a wiry figure with greasy hair and a smug expression. He leaned back in his chair, his hands cuffed to the table. Well, Lucas said with a sneer, if it isn't the hero cop. Daniel ignored the provocation, his voice calm but steely. Why? Lucas smirked. Why what? Be specific, officer. My memory's a little fuzzy. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes cold. Why did you do it? Why did you hurt Caleb? Lucas shrugged. Kid was annoying. Always crying, always getting in the way. Sarah didn't want to deal with him anymore, so I stepped in. Kept him out of sight. Out of mind. Simple. Daniel's fists tightened under the table. Out of mind. He's an 8-year-old boy, not a piece of furniture. He was starving. Chained up. Do you even realize what you've done? Lucas leaned forward, his smug grin widening. What I did was keep things quiet. You should be thanking me, officer. If Sarah had her way, she'd have dumped the kid on the street. Daniel's composure cracked for a moment, his voice rising. You think this is a joke? You think you're walking away from this? Lucas shrugged again. Doesn't matter. Sarah's the one who let it happen. I just followed her lead. The mention of Sarah made Daniel's stomach churn. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're not getting away with this, he said, his voice low and venomous. Not for a second. As Daniel left the room, Angela met him in the hallway. How'd it go? He's a monster, Daniel said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. But we've got enough to bury him. Angela nodded. We'll make sure he never gets the chance to hurt anyone again. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Good. Now I need to get back to Caleb. He's what matters. As he walked out of the station, Daniel felt a mix of anger and resolve burning in his chest. Lucas might face justice, but the damage he'd done to Caleb would take time to heal. And Daniel would be there every step of the way, no matter what it took. Healing wounds, building trust. The hospital room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of Caleb's heart monitor. Daniel Reed sat by his son's bedside, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as he watched Caleb sleep. The boy's fragile form was dwarfed by the oversized hospital bed, his face pale but peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. Daniel's thoughts swirled like a storm. He couldn't shake the image of Lucas's smug face during the interrogation, the vile justifications filling from his lips. He felt the weight of his failure, a deep ache in his chest as he thought about how much Caleb had endured while he was powerless to help. But amidst the guilt, a fierce determination burned within him. He had found Caleb, and now he was never letting go. A soft knock on the door pulled Daniel from his thoughts. He looked up to see Angela Torres standing in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Hey, she said softly, stepping inside. Thought you could use this. Daniel gave her a faint smile, taking the cup. Thanks, Torres. Angela glanced at Caleb, then back at Daniel. How's he doing? He's resting, Daniel said. The doctors are optimistic, but it's going to be a long road. Angela nodded, leaning against the wall. And you? How are you holding up? Daniel let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. I feel like I failed him. I should have fought harder, pushed more to find him. Maybe if I had, He wouldn't. His voice cracked, and he looked away, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Hey," Angela said firmly, stepping closer. "Don't do that to yourself. You did everything you could, and you found him. That's what matters now. Caleb needs you focused on what's ahead, not stuck on what's behind." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right. It's just hard." "I know," Angela said gently. "But you've got this, Reed. And you're not alone. We're all here for you." Daniel offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Torres." Angela gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before heading to the door. "I'll be outside if you need anything." Once she was gone, Daniel turned his attention back to Caleb. The boy stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. His blue eyes, so much like Daniel's own, locked onto him. "Dad?" Caleb's voice was soft, hesitant. "I'm here, buddy," Daniel said, leaning closer. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Caleb murmured, though his voice was weak. "It doesn't hurt as much." Daniel's heart twisted at the thought of how much pain Caleb must have endured. "That's good, buddy. The doctors are taking great care of you." Caleb nodded, but his expression turned serious. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" Daniel hesitated, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "Well, first, you're going to get better. The doctors will help you get stronger, and I'll be here with you every step of the way. Then, when you're ready, you're coming home with me." Caleb's eyes widened. "Really? I get to live with you?" "Of course," Daniel said firmly. "I'm going to make sure of it. No one's ever going to hurt you again." Caleb's lip trembled, and tears welled up in his eyes. "I thought you didn't want me anymore," he whispered. "Mom said. She said you were too busy and didn't care." Daniel felt his heart shatter. He reached out, gently cupping Caleb's face. "That was never true, Caleb. Not for a single second. I've always loved you, and I always will. I wanted to see you every day. But things were complicated. I'm so sorry, buddy." Caleb sniffled, his tears spilling over. "I missed you so much, Dad." Daniel pulled him into a gentle hug, mindful of the IV and monitors. "I missed you too, Caleb. More than you'll ever know." For a while, they just sat there, holding on to each other. Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that they were beginning to rebuild what had been broken. Reclaiming trust. Over the next few days, Caleb began to improve. The color slowly returned to his cheeks, and his voice grew stronger. The doctors monitored his progress closely, and physical therapy sessions were scheduled to help him regain his strength. Daniel stayed by his side through it all, helping him with meals, reading him stories, and reassuring him whenever the fear crept back into his eyes. He quickly learned that Caleb's scars weren't just physical. Every loud noise, every unexpected touch made him flinch. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and he often woke up crying out for help. "Dad," Caleb said one evening as they sat together watching cartoons on the small hospital TV, "what if Lucas comes back?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "He won't. Lucas is in jail, and he's not going to hurt anyone ever again." "But what if he gets out?" Caleb pressed, his voice trembling. Daniel took a deep breath, crouching down so he was eye level with his son. "Caleb, I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. Lucas can't hurt you anymore. You're with me now, and I won't let anything happen to you." Caleb nodded slowly, though the fear didn't entirely leave his eyes. "Okay, Dad." A new beginning. As Caleb's health improved, Daniel began to work on the next steps. He met with child services and legal advisors, filing the paperwork to gain full custody. The process was complicated, especially with Sarah still missing, but Daniel was determined. One afternoon, while Caleb was napping, Angela stopped by with an update. "We got a lead on Sarah," she said, lowering her voice. "She's been spotted in another state, staying at a shelter." Daniel's stomach churned. "Is she in custody?" "Not yet," Angela said, But we're working on it. She's got a long road ahead of her, too. Addiction doesn't just disappear. Daniel nodded, his emotions a mix of anger and sadness. I don't care what happens to her. My only concern is Caleb. And you're doing everything right for him, Angela said. You're giving him what he needs most, stability and love. Later that evening, Daniel sat by Caleb's bed, watching as his son slept peacefully. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a clarity about what truly mattered. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would face it together. As Caleb stirred awake, Daniel smiled. Hey, buddy. Caleb smiled back, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by trust. Hey, Dad. And in that moment, Daniel knew that no matter how broken things had been, they were beginning to heal. Pieces of a broken puzzle. 2 weeks had passed since Daniel Reed had found Caleb, and every day was a small victory. Caleb was discharged from the hospital under strict medical supervision, and Daniel brought him home to a modest 2-bedroom apartment he had rented just for the two of them. It wasn't much, but it was safe, clean, and filled with the promise of a new beginning. Caleb's recovery was slow but steady. He was eating better, gaining weight, and laughing more often, though the shadows of his trauma lingered in the corners of his eyes. Daniel had enrolled him in therapy with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. Despite the progress, Daniel knew that Caleb's wounds ran deep, both physically and emotionally. That evening, as Caleb sat on the living room couch flipping through a picture book, Daniel busied himself in the small kitchen preparing dinner. The clatter of pots and pans seemed to comfort Caleb, grounding him in the reality of his new, stable life. Dad. Caleb called, his voice tentative. Daniel wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked over to the couch. What's up, buddy? Caleb hesitated, looking down at the book in his lap. Are you going back to work? The question caught Daniel off guard. Why do you ask? I don't want you to leave, Caleb said quietly. What if you don't come back? Daniel crouched down in front of him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Caleb, I'm not going anywhere. My first priority is you. I've taken time off work so I can be here whenever you need me. Caleb looked into his father's eyes, searching for the truth. Promise. Daniel smiled softly. I promise. Unearthing the past. Later that night, after Caleb was tucked into bed, Daniel sat at his small desk in the corner of the living room, going through the growing stack of paperwork, custody filings, medical reports, therapy schedules. It felt like a mountain of logistics, but he attacked it with laser focus. Caleb's safety and future were the only things that mattered. As he worked, his phone buzzed. The name Angela Torres flashed on the screen. Hey, Torres, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. What's up? We found Sarah, Angela said, her voice grave. She's in custody. Daniel straightened. Where? A shelter in Nebraska flagged her when she tried to check in with fake ID. Turns out she was running from Lucas, too. She claims he got violent with her and kicked her out before we arrested him. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a mix of emotions surging through him. Is she sober? Barely, Angela said. She's been through hell, Daniel. She's agreed to cooperate with us, though. She might give us more insight into what Caleb went through. Daniel hesitated. Despite his anger and resentment, he needed answers. Do you think she'll talk to me? Maybe, Angela said. But approach with caution. She's fragile, and she's not the same person you knew. Daniel sighed. Set it up. I need to hear her side of the story. A fractured reunion. The next day, Daniel drove to the precinct where Sarah was being held. As he walked through the sterile halls, memories of their life together flashed in his mind. Their wedding day, Caleb's birth, and the early years when everything seemed perfect. But those memories were overshadowed by the bitter custody battle, her erratic behavior, and the devastating disappearance that followed. He was led into a small interview room where Sarah sat, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked thin and haggard, her once vivid green eyes dull and bloodshot. She barely looked up when Daniel entered. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. She flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't meet his gaze. "Daniel." He sat across from her, his eyes boring into her. "Why?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Why did you let this happen to Caleb?" Her shoulders sagged, and she finally looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it. But Lucas, he was controlling, violent, and I was weak." "Lucas may have been the one who hurt Caleb," Daniel said, his anger barely contained. "But you let him. You abandoned our son." "I didn't abandon him," Sarah snapped, her voice rising. I was scared. Lucas threatened to kill me if I tried to leave. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd at least leave Caleb alone. But then he started locking him up, and I couldn't stop him." Daniel's fists clenched under the table. "You could have called me. You could have done something." "I wanted to," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But every time I thought about it, I froze. I wasn't strong enough. And then one day, he threw me out. I didn't know what to do. I thought about going to the police, but I was so afraid of what Lucas would do if he found me." Her tears fell freely now, and for a moment, Daniel saw a glimpse of the woman he had once loved. But the damage was done, and forgiveness felt impossible. "What happens to Caleb now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's with me," Daniel said. "And that's where he's going to stay. You lost your chance to be his mother when you let Lucas hurt him." Sarah nodded, her head hanging low. "I know. I want him to know that I love him. That I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Daniel stood, his jaw tight. "If you want him to believe that, you're going to have to prove it. Get clean. Stay clean. And maybe, one day, you can be part of his life again." As he left the room, Daniel felt a mix of relief and frustration. He had the answers he needed, but they brought little comfort. Caleb's healing would take more than apologies or explanations. It would take time, patience, and unyielding love. Moving forward, when Daniel returned home, Caleb was waiting for him on the couch, a worried expression on his face. "Where did you go, Dad?" Daniel sat beside him, pulling him into a hug. "I went to talk to your mom." Caleb's eyes widened. "Mom, is she okay?" "She's safe," Daniel said carefully. "She wants you to know she's sorry for everything that happened." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know, buddy. But for now, it's just you and me. And we're going to be okay." Caleb nodded, leaning into his father's embrace. "I believe you." As they sat together, Daniel felt a sense of resolve. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were no longer walking it alone. Together, they would piece their lives back together, one step at a time. A glimpse of hope. That evening, as Daniel prepared dinner, Caleb stayed close by, quietly coloring at the kitchen table. His small hands gripped the crayons, and his tongue peeked out slightly as he focused on his drawing. Every so often, Daniel would glance over, a warm sense of gratitude washing over him. Caleb was safe now. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A chance to rebuild. "Dad?" Caleb asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yeah, buddy," Daniel responded, stirring a pot of pasta. "Do you think I'll have friends here?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Of course you will. Why wouldn't you?" Caleb shrugged, his eyes on the paper. "At the old house, Lucas said I wasn't allowed to play outside, and I wasn't allowed to go to school. He said I'd just get in the way." Daniel's grip tightened on the wooden spoon, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "Lucas was wrong, Caleb. You're going to school soon, and I know you'll make lots of friends. You're smart, kind, and funny. Who wouldn't want to be your friend?" Caleb looked up, his lips curving into a shy smile. You think so? I know so, Daniel said with conviction. And if you're ever nervous, just remember, you've got me in your corner. Caleb nodded, his smile growing a little wider. Thanks, Dad. Progress in small steps. The next few days were filled with a mix of challenges and triumphs. Caleb's therapy sessions began, and while he was hesitant at first, he slowly started to open up. His therapist, Dr. Layla Grayson, was patient and understanding, creating a safe space for Caleb to explore his feelings. After one particularly tough session, Caleb climbed into the car, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. How'd it go, buddy? Daniel asked as he pulled out of the parking lot. Caleb shrugged. Dr. Grayson is nice. She said it's okay to feel scared sometimes, but she also said I'm really brave for telling you everything. Daniel smiled, his chest swelling with pride. She's absolutely right. You're the bravest kid I know. Caleb looked out the window, his expression thoughtful. Do you think I'll ever stop being scared? Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice was steady. It might take some time, but yes, the fear will get smaller and smaller, and one day it won't feel so big anymore. And until then, I'll be right here, helping you through it. The first big milestone. A week later, Daniel took Caleb to visit his new school. It was a small, cheerful building with colorful murals on the walls and a playground buzzing with activity. Caleb clung to Daniel's hand as they walked through the halls, his wide eyes taking in everything. Do you think the kids will like me? Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniel crouched down to his level, looking him in the eye. They're going to love you. And if anyone gives you a hard time, you let me know, okay? Caleb nodded, gripping Daniel's hand a little tighter. The principal, a kind woman named Mrs. Carter, greeted them warmly and gave them a tour of the school. She knelt down to Caleb's level, smiling gently. We're so excited to have you here, Caleb. Your teacher, Mrs. Jacobs, is wonderful. She's already planning a seat for you next to some friendly kids who can help you get settled. Caleb smiled nervously, but Daniel could see a flicker of excitement in his eyes. Facing the ghosts. That evening, as they settled in for dinner, Caleb asked a question that took Daniel by surprise. Dad, do you think we'll ever have to see Lucas again? Daniel set down his fork, his expression serious. No, Caleb. Lucas is in jail, and he's not coming out anytime soon. You don't have to worry about him anymore. Caleb nodded, but his eyes were clouded with uncertainty. I still think about him sometimes, even when I don't want to. That's normal, Daniel said gently. What you went through with him was scary, and it's okay to feel upset or confused. But the most important thing to remember is that you're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore. Caleb tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Dr. Grayson said I could talk to you when I feel scared. Is that okay? Daniel leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on Caleb's. Of course it is, buddy. You can talk to me about anything, anytime. I'm always here for you. Caleb smiled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thanks, Dad. A glimmer of normalcy. As the days turned into weeks, a sense of routine began to take hold. Caleb started school, and though he was nervous at first, he quickly began to make friends. He loved art class the most, and Daniel proudly hung his drawings on the refrigerator. Each day felt like a small victory, a step toward the life they both deserved. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Caleb leaned against Daniel's side, a contented smile on his face. Dad, he said softly. Yeah, buddy. I like it here. It feels happy. Daniel wrapped an arm around him, his heart swelling with gratitude. I'm glad, Caleb. You deserve all the happiness in the world. As Caleb's laughter filled the room, Daniel felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they were growing fainter with each passing day. Together, they were building something new, something strong, something unbreakable. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel dared to believe that everything was going to be okay. The road ahead. The first hint of spring lingered in the crisp morning air as Daniel Reed stood by the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Through the apartment's window, sunlight filtered in, casting warm streaks on the walls. He glanced over at Caleb, who was seated at the table, meticulously spreading jam on a piece of toast. It was a simple scene, yet it filled Daniel with a profound sense of gratitude. 2 months had passed since Daniel had found Caleb, and the transformation in his son was nothing short of remarkable. Caleb had gained weight, his once hollow cheeks now fuller and tinted with a healthy flush. The bags under his eyes were gone, replaced by a brightness that Daniel hadn't seen in years. While there were still moments of hesitation and fear, Caleb's laughter was returning, piece by piece. "Are you excited for today?" Daniel asked, leaning against the counter with his mug in hand. Caleb nodded, though his movements were slow and deliberate. "Yeah. I think so." Daniel smiled gently. "It's okay to feel nervous. Big days like this can be a little scary. But you've got this, buddy, and I'll be right there with you." Today was the community art showcase at Caleb's school, where he'd be displaying a painting he'd worked on for weeks. It was the first time in years that Caleb had taken part in something public, and Daniel knew how much it meant to him. Caleb glanced up, his blue eyes searching Daniel's face. "You really think people will like it?" Daniel crouched down so they were eye level. "Caleb, I've seen your painting. It's amazing. But what matters most is that you're sharing something you worked hard on. That takes courage. I'm so proud of you." Caleb's lips quirked into a shy smile. "Thanks, Dad." A brave step forward. The school gymnasium buzzed with activity as parents, teachers, and students moved between rows of colorful art displays. Tables were covered in paintings, sketches, and crafts, each labeled with the artist's name. Daniel held Caleb's hand as they walked through the crowd, the boy's grip tightening slightly when someone bumped into him. "You okay?" Daniel asked softly. Caleb nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Yeah, I just don't like it when there are so many people." Daniel gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll take it slow. Let's find your painting and set up." Caleb led the way to a small table near the corner of the room. His painting rested on an easel, a vibrant depiction of a sunrise over a forest. The colors blended beautifully, and the detail in the trees was meticulous for an 8-year-old. "You've got some serious talent," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. Caleb's face lit up, a rare burst of confidence shining through. "I worked really hard on it. I wanted it to look happy." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling. "You nailed it." As the event began, Daniel watched from nearby as Caleb stayed by his painting, answering questions from curious parents and students. At first, Caleb's answers were short and hesitant, but as the compliments poured in, his confidence grew. By the end of the showcase, he was smiling and chatting with a group of kids from his class. When it was over, Caleb ran back to Daniel, his face glowing. "Dad, they liked it. They said it looked like something out of a storybook." Daniel knelt down and pulled him into a hug. "I told you they would. You're amazing, Caleb." For the first time in a long time, Caleb believed it. Facing the darkness. That night, as they settled in at home, Daniel noticed Caleb seemed unusually quiet. He sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around him, staring at the TV without really watching it. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, sitting beside him. "What's on your mind?" Caleb hesitated, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. "Today was really good," he said slowly, "but I kept thinking about Lucas." Daniel's chest tightened. "What about him?" "I keep wondering if he's mad at me," Caleb admitted, his voice small. "For calling you that day, for getting away." Daniel took a deep breath, his hand resting gently on Caleb's shoulder. "Listen to me, Caleb. What you did that day was brave. You saved yourself. Lucas was the one who did bad things, not you." None of what happened was your fault. Caleb looked up at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But what if he tries to find me? He won't, Daniel said firmly. Lucas is in jail, and he's not getting out for a very long time. You're safe now. I promise. Caleb nodded, though the fear didn't completely leave his eyes. Sometimes I still hear him yelling in my head. I don't want to think about him, but I can't stop. Daniel's heart ached as he pulled Caleb into a hug. That's normal, buddy. What you went through was really scary, and it's going to take time to heal. But every time those thoughts come, I want you to remember something. What? Caleb asked, his voice muffled against Daniel's chest. Remember how strong you are, Daniel said. You survived something really hard, and you came out of it even stronger. And no matter what, you've got me. We're a team, Caleb. Always. Caleb's small arms wrapped around his father. Thanks, Dad. A glimpse of the future. The following week, Daniel took Caleb to the park for a picnic. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to promise better things ahead. Caleb laughed as he played on the swings, his laughter carrying through the crisp air. For Daniel, it was a sound he never thought he'd hear again, and it was more precious than anything. As they sat together on a blanket, eating sandwiches and watching the ducks in the pond, Caleb turned to Daniel with a curious expression. Dad, he began, what do you think I'll be when I grow up? Daniel smiled. Anything you want to be. An artist, a teacher, maybe even a cop like me. Caleb giggled. A cop? Really? Sure, Daniel said. You're brave, smart, and you care about people. You'd make a great cop. Caleb tilted his head thoughtfully. Maybe, but I think I just want to be happy. Daniel felt his throat tighten. That's a perfect goal, buddy. And I'll do everything I can to help you get there. Caleb leaned against his father, a contented smile on his face. For the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel so scary. It felt like the beginning of something new, something good. And for both father and son, that was enough.